This culpable inattention to the true interest of the Church of Christ, which is not to be excused, more than any other iniquity, by the holy and wise permission and overruling providence of God, contributed to bring his church into the state of darkness and captivity in which she has continued for more than 1,000 years. Thus the example of so many eminent Christians and ministers in the latter part of the 4th, in the 5th, and 6th centuries, continuing in the communion of the Roman Church, when it was evident that she had adopted a system of apostasy, and that she was obstinately determined to persist in it, is so far from being an argument, as many have considered it, against secession from churches obstinate in a course of defection, that it serves rather to set the necessity of the secession of the faithful from such churches in a strong and affecting light. I thought these observations necessary to a right understanding of the sacramental communion which obtained in the ancient church. But with regard to the instances you have offered a variety of opinions and practices therein, and are no precedents for the scheme of Catholic communion in question, while there are no instances of any particular church having sacramental communion with avowed and obstinate opposers of what had been adopted by that church as a part of her scriptural profession. Alex. What was the condition of God's witness for truth during their struggle with papal Rome, before they came out of her? Until their separation, the Church of God was in her. If, as you suppose, it be unlawful for Christians to participate in the sacramental communion of churches that have things in their constitution and practice which we must account to be corruption, then no person could lawfully communicate with any member of the Church of God while she was in papal Rome. That is to say, God's own witnesses could not lawfully communicate with his own church. Rufus. It is necessary to attend to the distinction between communion with the invisible Church of God and communion with the visible. Communion with the Church as invisible, or with true Christians, having the same interest in Christ, the same Spirit, the same faith, can never have anything sinful in it. But communion with the Church as visible is so far sinful, as it is a communion in what is so. After it was evident that the Church of Rome had adopted the anti-Christian system, it was not always lawful. It was always unlawful, to have sacramental communion with it. But it does not follow that there are no members of the Church invisible within the verge of her visible communion, or that they have not communion with one another as members of the Church invisible. It is true, there is hardly any church that can justly be called Christian, which is so corrupt, or with which it is so criminal to have sacramental communion, as the Church of Rome. Yet there may be some within the pale of her visible communion who have a saving interest in Christ, and whose sin, being blotted out, no more deprives their souls of the benefit of the word and ordinances of Christ, still remaining in that church, than Jacob's lie deprived him of the blessing. I shall only add one observation more on this subject, which is, that as soon as the Roman Church became anti-Christian, God called his people to come out of her, because they could not be in her communion without partaking of her sins. Accordingly, for this reason, many of his people before the Reformation, as we have seen, came out of her. It is not denied that the call of providence, was louder at the time of the Reformation, and that, after the Papists had confirmed their errors and abominations by the decrees of the Council of Trent, and after people had better opportunities of knowing the truth and of joining themselves to a pure communion, the guilt and danger of continuing in the communion of the Church of Rome was far greater. But it does not follow, either that it was not sinful to continue in her communion before the era of the Reformation, or that now there are none of God's people within the precincts of her eternal communion. Even when scriptural Babylon is very near her final downfall, the call is given, "Come out of her, my people." Revelation 18, verse 4. Alex. Our conversation has been sufficiently protracted in taking a survey of the history of the ancient Church. Our inquiry into the principles and approved practice of the Reformed churches with regard to sacramental communion may be reserved for another opportunity.